He almost drove past it. $20. A broken piano nobody wanted. He had no idea it was about to change everything. His son heard music in something broken. His father heard a ghost. Neither of them knew what was hiding inside. Every night, one key at a time, they brought it back to life. But something underneath was waiting to be found. Hidden for 3 years, proof of a betrayal that destroyed his career, and a message his late wife had been waiting to send him. She protected the truth until he was ready to fight for it again. Now, everything was about to change.
If you have ever believed that the people closest to you would never betray you, watch this story until the very end, because what this single father found hidden inside a $20 piano would destroy one man's empire and heal a family that grief had nearly broken apart. Before we begin, if stories about second chances, quiet justice, and fathers who never give up move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens in the next 40 minutes will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Daniel Carter used to design buildings that touched the sky. 6 years ago, his name was on the glass doors of one of the most promising architecture firms in the city, a company he had built from nothing with his best friend since college, Richard Voss. Carter and Voss Architecture had been more than a business. It had been a dream two young men carried through sleepless nights, rejected proposals, and 100 cups of burnt coffee in a rented office above a laundromat. Daniel was the visionary, the one who sketched impossible curves on napkins and somehow made them structurally sound. Richard was the closer, the one who shook hands with investors and made promises Daniel later had to keep. For a while, it worked. For a while, Daniel believed nothing could break what they had built together. Then came the Meridian Tower project, the commission that was supposed to define both of their careers. Daniel poured 18 months of his life into those blueprints, refining every angle, every load-bearing wall, every detail of a design that married sustainability with soaring beauty. He remembers the night he finished the final draft, how his wife Sarah sat beside him at the kitchen table, humming softly while their son Ethan slept upstairs, telling him that the building looked like something out of a dream. He remembers believing that dream was finally within reach. He did not know that Richard had already begun quietly filing portions of that design under his own name, feeding select details to a rival investment group behind Daniel's back, positioning himself to walk away with both the credit and the client relationships the moment the ink dried. When the fraud was exposed within the company months later, it was not Richard who took the fall. Through a combination of forged documents, a compliant lawyer, and testimony from employees who feared losing their jobs, Richard managed to convince the board and eventually the courts that Daniel was the one who had mismanaged funds and breached contract terms. The lawsuit that followed drained Daniel's savings and his spirit. He lost the firm. He lost his professional license pending appeal. He lost, in the eyes of an entire industry, the reputation he had spent a decade building. Richard, meanwhile, rebranded the company as Voss Architectural Group and took the Meridian Tower credit with him, smiling for magazine covers as though he had designed it with his own 2 hands. The cruelest blow came 8 months later, when Sarah, who had stood beside Daniel through every court date and every sleepless night, was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that the doctors had somehow missed during her earlier routine visits. She fought for 11 months. Daniel sat beside her hospital bed with the same hands that once drew towers, now simply holding hers, memorizing the sound of her breathing because some part of him already knew he would need to remember it. Sarah passed away on a quiet March morning, with Ethan, then 6 years old, asleep in the chair beside her, still clutching the small stuffed rabbit she had given him. Daniel became, in the span of 2 brutal years, a man without a company, without a reputation, and without the woman who had made all of it bearable. The years after Sarah's death blurred together in a way Daniel found hard to explain to anyone who asked. Mornings began before sunrise, packing Ethan's lunch with whatever was on sale that week, checking twice that his son's shoelaces were tied because Daniel could not afford to be late for a construction call that paid by the hour. There were parent-teacher conferences where he caught other fathers glancing at him with a mixture of pity and quiet judgment, men who had read the old headlines about the Carter and Voss lawsuit and assumed, as most people had been led to assume, that Daniel was the one who had done something wrong. He stopped correcting people after a while. It took too much energy he did not have, and there was no version of the truth he could offer without proof that anyone was willing to believe. He learned to carry the weight of a reputation he did not deserve the same way he carried his toolbox, out of necessity, without complaint, because Ethan needed a father who still stood upright, even when the world had tried to knock him flat. 3 years later, Daniel was 39 years old, working as a handyman and occasional construction subcontractor, taking whatever jobs paid enough to cover rent and Ethan's school supplies. He had let his beard grow out, not from choice but from exhaustion, and there were streaks of gray at his temples that had not been there before Sarah died. He wore the same faded green flannel jacket nearly every day, its elbows worn thin, because buying a new one felt like an unnecessary luxury when Ethan needed new sneakers. Ethan, now 9, had inherited his mother's bright blue eyes and an insatiable curiosity that Daniel both treasured and worried over, because curiosity, he had learned the hard way, sometimes led a person straight into rooms they were not prepared to enter. It was a warm Saturday morning in early autumn when Daniel drove past a hand-painted sign reading estate sale, today only, staked crookedly into the lawn of a modest colonial house on Birchwood Lane. He almost did not stop. He had a cabinet repair job across town in an hour, and money was tight enough that browsing sales had become an unaffordable hobby. But Ethan buckled into the back seat, pressed his face to the window, and pointed at a row of dusty toolboxes lined up on a folding table near the driveway, and Daniel, unable to say no to the boy's hopeful expression, pulled over. The woman running the sale introduced herself as Margaret Ellison, a widow in her late 70s with silver hair pinned into a loose bun, and eyes that seemed to study Daniel a beat longer than a stranger's eyes should. She wore a cardigan the color of faded lavender and moved through her own yard, the way someone moves through a museum of their own memories, touching things gently as she passed. Daniel picked through the toolboxes while Ethan wandered toward the garage, and it was Ethan's voice, sudden and bright with discovery, that pulled Daniel's attention away from a rusted socket wrench. Dad, come look at this." Tucked in the shadowed back corner of the garage sat an old upright piano, its mahogany finish dulled and scratched, one leg braced with a stack of bricks where a caster wheel had long since broken off. Several of the ivory keys were chipped or missing entirely, exposing the wood beneath, and a thin crack ran diagonally across the fallboard like a scar. A masking tape price tag, curling at the edges, read simply $20. Ethan was already running his small fingers along the keys, delighted by the uneven, out-of-tune notes that echoed through the garage, and something in the sound, some fragile, imperfect echo of melody, struck Daniel somewhere he had not let himself feel in a long time. Sarah used to play piano. Sarah used to fill their old house with music on Sunday mornings, Ethan on her lap, both of them laughing when he hit the wrong keys. "That piano has been waiting a long time for the right hands," Margaret said, appearing at Daniel's shoulder as though she had been watching for exactly this moment. "It belonged to my late husband's family for 3 generations. Nobody in my own family plays anymore, and I could never bring myself to send it to the dump. $20 if you want it. Honestly, I would have given it away for free to the right person." She looked at Ethan for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then added quietly, almost to herself, "Some things find their way to exactly where they are needed." Daniel told himself it was foolish, that he had no truck to move it and no real space for a broken instrument neither he nor Ethan knew how to play. But Ethan was already looking up at him with the kind of pleading only a 9-year-old can manage, and Daniel, against every practical instinct, borrowed a neighbor's pickup truck that afternoon and hauled the piano home. Over the following weeks, restoring the piano became something neither Daniel nor Ethan had expected, a lifeline. Daniel researched key replacement online, sanded down the scarred wood in the evenings after work, ordered a cheap set of felt hammers and ivory substitute keycaps that he installed one by one at the kitchen table while Ethan did his homework beside him. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind that required patience Daniel had nearly forgotten he possessed. And for the first time in 3 years, father and son had something to build together that was not simply about surviving the week. Some evenings, Ethan would ask questions Daniel was not always ready for. He asked what Mom's favorite song was, and whether pianos could remember the people who played them, and why the wood underneath the lid smelled like old rain. Daniel answered as honestly as he could, telling Ethan about the Sunday mornings Sarah used to fill their old house with music, about how she would let a very small Ethan bang on the low keys and call it a duet, about the particular crooked way she smiled whenever she hit a wrong note and refused to start over. Talking about her no longer felt like reopening a wound the way it had in the first year. It felt more like handing something fragile and precious back and forth between them, a small ritual of memory neither of them wanted to put down. Ethan learned to hold a screwdriver properly that autumn, learned the names of felt hammers and dampers and tuning pins, and Daniel watched his son's small hands grow steadier with every passing week, the way his own hands had once grown steady over a drafting table, back when he still believed the world rewarded careful work. It was Ethan's curiosity, inevitably, that led to the discovery. One evening, while Daniel was underneath the piano tightening a leg brace, Ethan climbed onto the bench and began pressing experimentally on the panel beneath the keyboard, the way children press on everything within reach. He noticed that one section of the wooden panel beneath the keys did not sit flush with the rest, and when he pushed at its edge, it shifted, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment built into the piano's frame, the kind of space a craftsman might once have used to hide small valuables during long journeys or uncertain times. Inside, wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth, Ethan found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon and a rolled set of architectural drawings, brittle at the edges, along with a leather-bound journal whose cover was worn soft from handling. Daniel, at first, assumed these belonged to Margaret's late husband's family, remnants of some long-forgotten hobby. But when he unrolled the drawings under the kitchen light, his hands began to shake, because he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his own. These were the original working drawings for the Meridian Tower, the ones he had believed lost forever during the lawsuit, complete with his margin notes, his early sketches, and dates that predated anything Richard Voss had ever filed under his own name. The journal belonged to Sarah. Reading her handwriting again after 3 years undid something in Daniel that he had spent a long time carefully holding together. In the entries, dated from the final months of Daniel's legal battle, Sarah had written about her fear that Richard would destroy every piece of evidence proving the truth, and about a decision she had made quietly, without telling Daniel, to gather copies of his original drawings from an old backup drive before the firm's servers were wiped during the litigation. She had printed them, hidden them, and, in a detail that made Daniel's chest ache, written that she intended to store them somewhere Richard would never think to look, somewhere safe, until Daniel was strong enough to fight again. She had planned to tell him. She simply ran out of time. The letters told a second, harder story. They were correspondence between Sarah and her older sister, Colleen, written in the year before Sarah's diagnosis. In them, Sarah pleaded with Colleen to return or account for a set of family heirlooms, jewelry and savings bonds left to Sarah and Colleen jointly by their late parents, which Colleen had quietly liquidated during a period of financial desperation without ever telling Sarah the truth. Sarah had forgiven her sister in writing, gently, the way she forgave most things, but she had also written that she felt the distance growing between them, a betrayal she carried quietly so as not to add more weight to a family already strained by Daniel's collapsing career. Daniel had never known any of this. Sarah had shielded him from it, the same way she had shielded him from so much, right up until the very end. For several nights, Daniel did not know what to do with any of it. Anger came first, sharp and consuming, the kind of anger that made him want to drive across town and put the drawings on Richard's desk himself, to watch the smugness drain from his former friend's face. He thought about Colleen, about confronting her, about the years of holiday dinners where she had sat across the table pretending nothing was wrong. He thought about how easy it would be to let all of it curdle into bitterness, to become a man who let betrayal define the rest of his life, exactly the kind of man Ethan did not deserve as a father. He read Sarah's journal 3 times that first week, each pass surfacing something new. A line about how frightened she was of leaving Ethan too soon. A line about how proud she was of Daniel even when the world was not. A line, near the very end, where her handwriting grew shakier, reminding herself to move the drawings somewhere Daniel would eventually find them, someplace patient. He sat with the letters between Sarah and Colleen for even longer, rereading the careful, forgiving tone Sarah had used even while clearly hurting, and Daniel realized with a fresh ache that his wife had spent her final year protecting nearly everyone around her from the truth of her own pain, absorbing betrayal quietly so that no one else would have to carry it. It did not feel fair. None of it had ever felt fair. But sitting there at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and Ethan asleep upstairs, Daniel understood that Sarah had left him more than evidence. She had left him a choice about who to become with it. It was Ethan, in his simple, unguarded way, who shifted something back into place. Sitting at the piano one evening, picking out a clumsy version of a tune Sarah used to hum, Ethan asked Daniel why he looked so sad about finding something so cool. Daniel tried to explain, in words a 9-year-old could hold on to, that sometimes people we trust hurt us, and that it takes time to figure out what to do about it. Ethan considered this with the seriousness only children can summon and said that Mom always told him the piano just needed someone patient enough to fix it one key at a time, and maybe that was true of people too. Daniel sat with that for a long while after Ethan went to bed. He decided in the end that the goal was not revenge in the way that word usually gets used. It was not about destroying Richard Voss for the satisfaction of it, or humiliating Colleen for a debt of grief she was already quietly carrying. It was about the truth standing where it belonged, in the open, where it could no longer be buried under someone else's convenient version of events. Daniel spent 2 weeks gathering everything: the original drawings with dated margin notes, Sarah's journal establishing the timeline, an old email archive he was able to recover from a defunct backup service, and a formal letter from a forensic document examiner confirming the drawings predated the versions Richard had filed. He brought all of it to a lawyer who had once believed in his case but had lacked the evidence to prove it 3 years earlier. The reopening of the case moved faster than Daniel expected, partly because Richard, having grown complacent in his stolen success, had left a trail of similar shortcuts in 2 other projects that former colleagues, once too afraid to speak up, were now willing to corroborate once they saw Daniel finally had proof. Voss Architectural Group's reputation did not survive the unraveling. Clients withdrew. The board that had once believed Richard's version of events voted to remove him within a month of the story breaking. Daniel's professional license, suspended pending appeal for 3 long years, was fully reinstated, and the court ordered a public correction of record crediting Daniel Carter as the original designer of the Meridian Tower. Before any of that became public, Daniel asked to meet Richard once, in person, at a quiet coffee shop far from either of their offices. He brought only a single copy of the original Meridian Tower drawing, the one with his own handwriting dated 18 months before Richard's filed version. Richard looked older than Daniel remembered, and for a moment, when he saw the drawing on the table between them, something flickered across his face that might have been shame, though it passed quickly, replaced by the same practiced composure that had once made him so persuasive in boardrooms. He tried briefly to argue that memory was unreliable, that paperwork got misfiled, that Daniel was chasing ghosts. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply said that he was not there to ask Richard for anything, because the drawing was already on its way to a lawyer, a forensic examiner, and a court that had gotten it wrong the first time. He said he had spent 3 years wondering what he would say in this exact moment, and that in the end, all he wanted Richard to know was that Sarah had spent the last year of her life protecting the truth Richard had tried to bury, and that some things simply cannot stay buried forever. Then he stood, left enough cash on the table to cover both coffees, and walked out without waiting for a response. It was the last conversation the 2 men ever had. Daniel did not gloat. He did not attend the press conference where Richard's downfall was formally announced, choosing instead to spend that afternoon teaching Ethan how to properly tune the piano's middle octave, the 2 of them laughing every time a string slipped hopelessly flat. When a local journalist eventually tracked him down for comment, Daniel gave a short, steady statement about the importance of honest work and honest people, and said nothing more about Richard at all. It was, in its own quiet way, the loudest kind of justice. The conversation with Colleen took longer, and it was harder in a different way, because there was no courtroom, no evidence file, only 2 people who loved the same woman and had lost her too soon. Daniel drove to Colleen's house with the letters in a folder on the passenger seat and Ethan waiting in the car. And when Colleen opened the door and saw the folder in his hands, she seemed to already know. She wept before he said a single word, and told him, through broken sentences, about the debts she had hidden out of shame, about a struggling marriage she had never told the family about how she had meant to tell Sarah everything and simply never found the courage before it was too late. Daniel did not offer easy forgiveness that day. He offered something more honest, the chance to start telling the truth, slowly, the way you restring a piano one wire at a time, and an invitation to Ethan's next school recital if she wanted to come. They talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, longer than they had spoken honestly to each other in years. Colleen told him about the months after their parents' funeral, how a failed investment and a husband who had quietly emptied their joint account left her drowning in debt she was too proud to admit to anyone, least of all her own sister. She had sold the jewelry piece by piece, telling herself each time that she would replace it before anyone noticed, and by the time Sarah asked directly, there was nothing left to give back except an apology Colleen had never found the courage to write down fully. Daniel listened without interrupting. The folder of letters closed on the table between them, and when Colleen finally asked whether he could ever forgive her, he told her the truth, that forgiveness was not something he could hand over in a single afternoon, but that he was willing to try, because Sarah had tried, and because Ethan deserved an aunt who showed up rather than a stranger who sent birthday cards out of guilt. It was not a perfect reconciliation. It was an honest one, and Daniel had come to understand that honest was worth infinitely more than perfect. By the following spring, Daniel had opened a small architecture practice of his own, Carter Design Studio, its first commission a modest community library, funded partly by donations from former colleagues who had quietly believed in him all along. He dedicated the building's reading room to Sarah, a plaque near the window reading simply, "For the woman who kept the music, and the truth, safe until we were ready." The piano, fully restored, its mahogany gleaming, its keys replaced one careful evening at a time, sat in the corner of their living room, no longer broken, no longer waiting. Ethan, who had taken to lessons with unexpected devotion, played his first real recital piece that June, a simple, imperfect rendition of the tune his mother used to hum. And Daniel sat in the front row with Colleen beside him, both of them crying for reasons that had finally become more about gratitude than grief. The school auditorium was small and warm, filled with the shuffle of folding chairs and the smell of fresh coffee from the parent volunteers table near the door. Ethan wore a collared shirt Daniel had ironed twice that morning out of nervous energy, and when his name was called, he walked up to the piano with the same steady, deliberate steps Daniel remembered from all those evenings spent replacing felt hammers together. His fingers found the opening notes a little too fast, then settled, the melody rising uncertain and beautiful through the room, imperfect in exactly the way Sarah's playing used to be, and Daniel found himself gripping the arms of his chair, overwhelmed by the strange, aching joy of watching his son carry something forward that neither loss nor betrayal had managed to take from either of them. Margaret Ellison came to that recital too. Daniel had gone back to thank her properly once the case reopened, and it was only then she told him, gently, that she had known Sarah years earlier through a community piano program, long before Daniel and Sarah had ever married, and that Sarah had once mentioned, in an offhand way during a lesson, that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped whatever she needed to protect would end up somewhere safe, somewhere patient, somewhere that would wait for exactly the right hands to open it. Margaret had never fully understood what Sarah meant until the day Ethan's small fingers found that hidden panel. Some things, it turns out, really do find their way to exactly where they are needed. The community library itself became something of a quiet local landmark by the end of that year. A modest brick building with tall windows designed to catch the morning light. Its reading room lined with donated books and a row of small round tables where children did their homework after school, much the way Ethan once had at the kitchen table beside his father. Daniel walked through it often after it opened. Running his hand along door frames, he had measured himself, feeling something settle in his chest that he had not felt since long before the lawsuit, since long before he had learned exactly how much a person could lose and still keep walking. It was not the tallest building he had ever designed, and it would never appear on a magazine cover the way the Meridian Tower once had, but it was entirely, unmistakably his, built on drawings no one could take credit for ever again. Daniel Carter never got his old company back, and he never wanted it. What he got instead was something sturdier, a reputation rebuilt on truth rather than borrowed credit. A sister-in-law slowly becoming family again, instead of a stranger across the table, and a son who had learned, at 9 years old, that patience and honesty could fix almost anything, even things the world had already given up on. Every evening now, when the light through the living room window turns gold, the sound of an old, once-broken piano drifts through their small house, imperfect in places, beautiful in all the ways that matter, Proof that the things worth $20 are sometimes worth absolutely everything.